Welcome to Defend's weekly container security group discussion. I think all of our agenda items come from Sam, at least the ones at the top. So do we want to jump right into planning breakdown? Do we want to wrap up that conversation we just started around the workflows? I don't want to be the
I think we can dive into
one.
planning breakdown,
okay.
And we'll go from there. So I really just have one for today, which is to provide an out-of-the-box network policy set. And really the work here is both for engineering to propose what that policy set would be. So first to develop and get approval on a default policy set, and then the second step would be to deploy it by default in a disabled state when Cilium is first installed. And so that process could just be instructions in our documentation on how to deploy that default policy set. But in any case, the user would be able to, by default launch that out-of-the-box policy set. If we're doing it for them, it should come disabled by default, and then they could enable it. If it's just documentation, then obviously they can choose whether to enable or disable it depending on what they want to do. So hopefully a fairly small one. Are there any questions on this? I did start a small list of things that I might include, but I was just trying to seed the discussion here. I feel like I'm not the expert in this case, that I would really look to probably somebody like Arthur, who's more experienced with Cilium, to put together what they would propose as a default set of rules here, or default container network policies.
I have a question. We would get the input from the user in terms of the namespace and things like this. Is that the goal?
So where this is a default out of the box one, I'm envisioning this being something similar to like our default OWASP policy set with the web application firewall, where, hopefully we write these policies in a generic way that it's something that most users would want applied to all of their environments and all of their namespaces. So if they wanted to go in and customize the policies after the fact or limit it to specific namespaces, that's okay. But, we should write policies that are just general good security practices, across the board, that meets like 99% of most applications usage. Because, if we try to get too specific, we're gonna be blocking things or, logging things that are legitimate traffic.
I got a follow-up question. So it sounded like we don't much care about the namespace. It would apply to all the containers or to all the namespaces.
Correct. Yeah, all the namespaces and all the clusters.
All right. And then the second thing is, if the spirit of the problem to solve is that get like give users a head start or give them some idea of what policies look like, should we have some blocking rules instead of just logging, because they're going to be deployed in an audit only. That's I think I read that somewhere. And do you think that would cause issues if they decided to enforce that and start breaking? Because most things will be doing like port 443 or 80 or some other service, and everything else should be disabled. So if we provide those rules, it probably does what most of the users want. I don't know if that was an actual question.
I would expect our rules, the way we write them, to just log the traffic. I think actually switching things between logging and blocking right now with Cilium, as I understand it from Arthur, that's really a Cilium-wide thing. You can't control that on a per policy basis right now very well. It's more of, once you put it into blocking mode where all of Cilium is blocking, then you write rules that are exceptions to that and allow traffic through. And so we would not want to recommend customers to go down that route, because that's going to be a pretty, difficult path to go unless they write rules that allow all of the traffic through that's legitimate. And unless they're experienced at writing Cilium network policies, there's going to be a high risk that they make a mistake there. So for now, you'll notice here, all of mine are focused on logging, but the assumption that Cilium as a whole is set to allow traffic and just log it by default. So you would be logging anything that, may be malicious or suspicious, or things that, may be cause of concern. But, the intent, the sort of prime directive or imperative here is like, let's not block valid production traffic, but at the same time, can we give them an out-of-the-box set that lets them, deploy some good, best practice security rules that let them log the traffic that might be concerning.
I just wanted to say that we tried to solve this problem once when we were all in Cilium, and we were discussing which policies to deploy by default, and the outcome was that we don't really know much about users' deployments, and based on that, I actually struggle to suggest even right now something sensible rather than block everything. Yeah, the only idea I have is to leverage applications that we bundle kind of into GitHub, like Ingress, Elastic Stack, Fluency, and all other software that you can install into your cluster for the GitLab, and maybe write policies around that. So essentially, when you install Elastic Stack, you will have an ability to isolate it and pass the traffic from Elastic Stack to your application and in the opposite direction. But something more generic, it's really tricky. Pods are not necessary. Will be 18.443 for applications in Kubernetes. So even like writing a policy for HTTP traffic is a bit tricky. And we can't really use any static information, like let's say protocol is TCP, but then which port to use to block specific traffic, like let's say HTTP in the app, it's huge unknown. Like if you go and check network policy app right now, it's actually, its ports are not serving HTTP traffic on port 80, they are serving on 8080. And then SSL termination is actually happens usually on ingress. So I don't want to go deep into the technical details, but I just want to emphasize that we actually try to solve that. And unless we will get some additional input from PMs, I don't think we can come up with something that will work, because I personally don't know much about user deployments.
Yeah, I mean, so the deployments are going to be so diverse that, the only rules that we can really write are ones that are likely to be very common across all of them. So like the examples that I have here, logging all traffic between namespaces, sort of the assumption there is, that in a typical cluster, you wouldn't really want or need traffic to cross between namespaces. Now there's always going to be an exception to that. For every one of these, you're going to find a customer that has a reason not to do that. But if we can stick with rules that are common for, the way that most people use it, that's really where I'm headed. And we definitely don't want to block anything, because there's a chance that we have the rules wrong because we don't know each individual customer's environment. But the intent of this is just to provide a base set for them, where they can see like, this is a starting point and they can customize it. So if they've got traffic going out of port 8080 instead of, 443, they can go in and just tweak that. Same thing with these other ones, like logging traffic between containers and the host. the assumption there is that, that should be infrequent, if at all. And so you at least want to log that, logging any outbound initiated traffic that, any egress traffic. Again, assuming most traffic should be inbound, not outbound. And then, some sort of like port filter. But I don't know, do you feel like these are too specific still, or are we just going to get a flood of logs that's going to drown their sim?
No, it's just from implementation perspective, like you're saying, logo traffic between namespaces. It means like on implementation level, like if I was a DevOps engineer and I wanted to do that, I would go and place a policy in each specific namespace that I want to isolate against other namespaces. So to implement that, I need to know namespaces where to put those. I know namespaces of the app, but other than that, what I know right now is where GitLab applications are located and where the app is located. And other than that, these two, I can't really write a policy around other namespaces because I don't have information about namespace labels.
So it'd have to almost be dynamically generated.
Yes. And then similar to containers and hosts is IP addresses, as I understand it. So someone needs to know those IP addresses before putting those into policy. Similar to containers identified by labels. I just can't get this information right now from anywhere. It's really a tough one, to be honest. Yeah, and then outbound traffic is somewhat easier, but again, it's namespace specific. I can, let's say, allow all outbound traffic or block all outbound traffic in namespace. And again, policies, namespace scope, I need to know namespace. And to reiterate the same, on GitLab side, we only know like how to put policies inside GitLab managed apps namespace. It's a namespace that is managed by a registration group, and namespace of the actual app. So we know namespace, the environment of the application. So those two we know. Other than that, it's like completely gray area to us right now. And I think GitLab doesn't really try to get up there, at least from my understanding. From what this configure group is doing, they're trying to isolate themselves into like corner of the cluster and don't get permissions to anything else unnecessary. So yeah, I will try to think about it, but we will still might need to some kind of user input. We can't define a policy that is ready to use completely. We still might need some kind of user input.
So it could be talking about something that scans the cluster, figures out what the namespaces are, figure out container, host, and then does the best shot at creating something.
I was thinking, like, let's say we want to policy logo and traffic between namespaces. We would need to ask user which namespaces he wants include specifically, and then we will go and configure that. We won't ask the policy itself, but we need to know at least namespaces. It's similar like traffic containers and hosts. Like we will go and ask which hosts you want.
I understand that. What I was saying is that we can still make it a little bit easier than just typing. We could figure out what the namespaces are and say, hey, here are the namespaces you have. Which ones do you want to log?
Yeah, so what I was proposing is even simpler than that. I guess I should add in the word all, right? Like log all traffic between all namespaces. So we wouldn't even prompt the user. We would just assume that they want to monitor it for everything.
Right.
And same thing with this one, it would be between all containers and the host.
Yeah, the problem with that is
the pods.
Namespaces, like the policy itself is scoped around namespace. It's by design of Kubernetes policy. It's scoped by namespace. There is no way to widen the scope. Cilium technically supports cluster-wide policies, but if you will just stick to the Kubernetes policies, it's only can go as wide as a single namespace. There is no way to expand it on a cluster level. So the only way to achieve this is to put multiple policies for each namespace.
That's why in the beginning I was thinking that we would have a little bit more input to be able to handle this. I have a question, Sam. Do you think that there would be a place in GitLab that we can have like a suggestion of network policy that I don't know how the UI would be for that, and then the person would click a couple of options, and based on the options we would have the network policy with the labels if needed, or namespace or things like this. So then in a way that the customer doesn't know exactly how the policy is formatted, but they can figure out something.
Yeah, so that's what Arthur's
Sorry.
working on with the policy editor. Go ahead, Arthur.
I was saying that I see this feature as more as a template rather than finished thing. Like, let's say what Andy is working on right now is the builder, right? Some kind of UI. We could produce templates up there, something that will allow them to create a policy a bit faster by selecting a predefined template and then put some values in there, and it's ready to go. But it's really hard to imagine right now something that will work out of the box without additional user guidance on like across multiple clusters. Yeah, that's why it's a bit harder problem, and that's why cluster mesh is a thing when it's a bit easier to discover and secure things up there, because cluster mesh controls the whole traffic plane. Yeah, but
A couple of questions before. Just can I ask about the logging? We'll go back to the other one. But Sam, do you mean like just his log Fluency, or something more like in terms of metrics, like doing stuff in Prometheus?
No, this would just go out via syslog through Fluency.
Cool.
Which I think we already have that capability today.
Yeah, we
yes.
do. Yeah. Yeah, I just
Right.
want to make sure, because if we want to do like charts and things like that in Prometheus, that'll be a different format.
Yeah, that's a different effort.
So Arthur, going back to something you mentioned before, you said Cilium supports cluster-wide policies. Would that be an option? Just recommending or suggesting that, all right, if you wanna have these GitLab supported templates, you need to be using Cilium.
For some of those, but I think intention of the cluster-wide policy is to work with external traffic to the cluster, from the cluster into the cluster, because it works across namespaces, like it's to control cluster ingress or ingress. So yeah, some of those might work based on the Cilium cluster-wide policies, but I need to do a bit more investigation in that. We have not tried to deploy those yet. So yeah, I have only limited knowledge in this area.
Well, I'm making some notes. I'm gonna add these comments to the design issues. Is that okay, Sam? Or would you prefer them on the epic? I think they should go on the design issue, because that was the point of creating an epic, to leave it sort of clean.
I was just going to ask about the design
either way.
issue, Sam. It's pretty empty.
Yep. I mean, this one doesn't involve UX, but I thought we agreed we would create these even when UX was not involved, just to capture the workflow as the requirements were getting.
Oh, that makes sense. I
solidified.
guess it was the part I was missing was that this didn't involve UX. So thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Lindsay, I think we're going to be using that design issue mostly as an area for discussing these requirements and following up the things that Zamir and Arthur brought up. I'll put some comments in there, and we'll follow up asynchronously.
Okay. Well, it sounds like this one is not quite ready for refinement then. I guess, I don't know. I don't want to put words in your mouth, Tiago. this list here is not definitive, though. You know, we can remove things, we can add things, we can change things in this list. Again, you know, the requirements are up here. This list was just to start the discussion and to seed some initial thought.
Yeah, I'm gonna be going back to the problem to solve, and if we come up with something that doesn't fit there, that's okay. But it's about giving users a starting point and some templates that show them what we can support and what they can do. Whether or not they need to do a little bit of extra work, where we're gonna try to query the cluster to come up with some pre-filled values. I don't know. I'll rely on Zamir and Arthur to kind of guide us on that. So yeah, we'll be following up this week. Hopefully, next week we'll have some, or before that, to have something a bit more concrete.
So I guess the question would be, do you feel this is ready to go into refinement, or do we still need further requirement clarification in the problem or the planning breakdown phase?
I think we're still in planning breakdown. I would even say we kind of in the design phase. Doesn't have design artifacts, but in the like sort of technical design of the solution. So yeah.
Yeah, I don't have an input on the process, but yeah, I will try to research a bit more and see what we can do up there. But yeah, we tried it once, and it was a really tough one to like put something generic that would work from our perspective to multiple users. We had a really long thread before, and I think it's gonna, like, if you want just generalize in some way, like templating or something, it's just going to be another thread when we're going to just be bringing all the edge cases that will not work for certain situations. Yeah, I just need a bit more time, probably.
So given that, Sam, this is probably not what you want to hear, but given that you're going to do some research anyway, should I have a ticket in that epic to track this research, track some experiments, define what we're trying to find out, the answers that we're trying to get?
No, I think I will
sure, yeah. Either way.
What makes sense for me, it's just to try to implement Sam's list, which is sensible defaults, and I see where he's coming from. It's just with Kubernetes a bit tricky to implement than with typical firewall. And then maybe find other use cases. Maybe Zamir will come up with something and I come up with something. Then maybe out of the discussion, we will find some trends or something, because it's all about, it feels to me, finding something that will work in most cases without like having too many edge case situations that will not work for users.
Okay, so it sounds like you're talking hours rather than days. I'd be comfortable putting a couple of questions in the design issue, and then you two can answer them. Is that a good approach?
Yeah, I think so.
Zamir, you happy with that?
Yeah.
Yeah, everyone?
Yeah, that sounds great. And I would say, I mean, I know I covered this earlier, but just keep in mind, you know, these policies are not blocking. We should do logging only. And, you know, if we do deploy it by default, then we would want to deploy it disabled by default, you know, so that we do have some guardrails in there to protect ourselves from, you know, accidentally nuking the customer's environment if they do have one of those edge cases where the policy is just wrong for them.
So disabled, you mean it wouldn't even be logging, like the policy is there, but it's not active?
That's one is
correct.
super easy to implement, honestly, and that's what I would personally would do right now, is to put a list of the default policies into the UI. They will not be deployed, they just will be in the UI, like a constant strings in the code, and then user can have an option to enable it. And when it's enabled, it automatically goes into cluster, and then it's their policy rather than ours, because it will have ID inside the cluster, and they will be able to manage it as it was their own policy. So implementation is not hard. I think it's quite an easy part of this specific job, but finding good defaults, that's the my main problem for me.
Cool. I'll
Okay,
update the
I know
issue.
we're up on time. I had a couple other notes there. For the most part, you can just go read those on your own. But I just do want to show and highlight, this new roadmap section that I have on our category direction pages. If you haven't seen that, take a look at it. I've also built out pretty much everything for container behavior analytics to viable, and network security. I'm still getting there, but I'm getting close to having everything in there to go to viable. But again, feel free to take a look at those separately if you have any questions or concerns, or if you see anything that's missing, don't hesitate to let me know.
Yep, thanks for doing that. It's really helpful.
I've had a look.
All
Yeah,
right,
it's looking good.
cool, thanks. Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.